Professor Niels-Juel Nielsen, would you describe for us how your study of identical twins reared apart began?
Yes. It started back in 1954, and it started in the way that at that time I was working as a young psychiatrist in an outpatient department, and there I had a patient, a female of 54, and she had a psychiatric history, of course, and then she told me during that interview that she was actually a twin, but she didn't know her twin sister very well because they had been separated at the age of 3 weeks, something like that. They had very little contact, and but from what she told me, I could I had the impression that they were monozygotic twins, which they showed up to be later. And then I was familiar with the study done in your country by Newman, Freeman, and Holzinger, and then I decided it might be interesting to study this case more carefully. We got into contact with a twin sister, a psychologist and I, and then we sat down and discussed what we could do about it, and we just decided that we would try to investigate them as thoroughly as possible and look for differences and similarities, and we had to use the tool available, psychological testing we were using in the clinic, and interviewing, and then of course the medical examinations. And then a few weeks later, a newspaperman, a journalist, approached me. He heard about my interest in such studies, and then he reported a case where a woman had approached another woman in the street, and she had asked this second woman, "Do you have a sister living in this particular town?" And she said, No, I have no sisters. I was adopted. I was placed in adoptive home." But then it turned out that they were twins, monozygotic twins brought up apart. So we had 2 cases at hand, and we waited for a long time before the 3rd case appeared. We felt we should have 3 cases.
Rounded out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, well, it really lasted 10 years to collect the 12 cases I've been studying, and that only came about because in the meantime I found out that a Danish twin register was available, a register of all twins born in Denmark from 1880 to 1920, and I went through all these cases. I think there were about 7,000 or 8,000 same-sex pairs. I found about 50 pairs who were likely to be monozygotic twins, brought up apart from early childhood, and alive and available for investigation. But we came down to 12 cases.
You know, when we began our study and we worked with our first set of twins, I think we had the same orientation. Our idea was to look for differences because clearly they would be environmental, and
Yes.
from the point of view of a psychologist, that's sort of the most interesting feature of this kind of a study. But we were absolutely amazed at the degree of similarity in our first pair. I think that's really what grabbed us. It was quite astounding. What was your first pair like?
Well, we're very much alike, and So it was in the beginning that we were very impressed by the similarities because they were so striking and unexpected. Later on, of course, we looked for differences, but that's, as you know very well, the difficult thing. What is a difference?
Where are they, and what is a difference?
Yes.
Yeah, the
And
definition.
what is a similarity? And can you measure a difference between two people?
Yeah, the problems of the reliability of measurement
Right.
and the level of analysis and the meaning of what you're seeing.
That's really
they're
the
difficult.
problem.
We've discussed a few points, and I recall reading in your book a comment that you never came to any general solution to the nature-nurture problem. And that led me to think that while you might not have come to a general solution, you may have some very specific ideas about the interaction of nature and nurture. Could you comment on that?
Well, that general solution, that general conclusion, I really quoted Newman and co-workers, and they said something like that such studies will probably never give general conclusions because they'll raise more questions and answers. It may not be true, but in my case, I mean, I was working with only 12 cases, so beforehand it was not very likely that we could arrive at general conclusions, but still I think the study of a single case is valuable, very valuable, because you're faced with data and you have to explain them, and very often you end with data that are so similar that the only explanation left is that you must assume that some genetic factors are in action, or have been in action.
My colleague, Professor Licken, has discussed this in a couple of contexts, and he's moving toward the conclusion that perhaps Gordon Allport was right, that personality is highly idiographic. We find a set of twins will be remarkably similar in many domains: interests, personality, perhaps some modest psychiatric symptoms, very similar ability patterns, yet they'll be dramatically different from every other twin we've looked at. And so you see a highly unique structure replicated in each twin.
Yes, that's perhaps when we talk about heredity, we tend to talk about something running in the families and something you can discover among siblings or parents. But perhaps if you look at one person, he's unique, and except for monozygotic twins, every human being is unique in his genotype. So you might have a certain constellation which is unique, but it will also be unique for this particular twin pair. And you may not be able to find certain characteristics among the siblings or among other people.
Yeah.
So you're left with a problem that it's very difficult to find these cases. But, well, up to now, including your study, there will be more than 100 cases in the literature, cases of monozygotic twins reared apart. And you cannot continue to ignore these reports because they challenge you. You have to take an attitude sooner or later. But as you stressed, it's a question of measuring, and our methods are the problem here.
Yeah,
because the twin method in itself, I mean, diagnosing monozygosity is no problem at all. But you could tell me a bit about your methods. I know about them, but I would like to.
Well, of course, we're using basically the same design. We search for identical. We're also searching for fraternal twins root apart as well, and we diagnose them using standard genetic techniques for blood markers. One of the I've always been cautious about psychological tests. I've always thought they were interesting and useful and a valuable contribution from psychology, but I was always cautious about them, always feeling that there was a larger range of error than was desirable. But now we've studied 21 sets of identical twins, and we have a good number of cases who have virtually identical profiles on some of our psychological tests. And this evidence has persuaded me that our tests in many instances are even better than we thought they were. In fact, I can't think of more convincing evidence than seeing two identical twins reared apart come in, take a test, and get very, very similar scores. It's quite striking. And that data, while it's preliminary, of course we hope to gather many more twins, is pointing to the conclusion that twins reared together in the same family are as similar as they are primarily for genetic reasons, but not for reasons of our environment. I noticed when I told you that a few days ago, you were not a bit surprised.
No, because first of all, I had a few cases demonstrating that, and our colleague, which we should mention, James Shields in London, he found the very same thing, that in some of his separated cases the twins were more similar in certain respects, personality traits, than those who had been brought up together. And I think a very simple explanation, which you know, of course, is that one could assume that being psychologically a monozygotic twin is a special situation, and it will develop. It will result in a division in roles, one being the more dominant partner, the other one the more submissive partner, and so on. In personality, they will try to maintain their own personal their identity, and in this way they will tend to become different. Whereas if you are alone, like most of us are, in an environment, you may perhaps follow a course. At least you do not have this problem of having your double next to you.
Yeah, there's a feature of the environment that's not there influencing you in a sense. Is this what Zazo calls the couple effect?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's technically about the same sort of thing as he calls the couple effect. This kind of finding, though, it seems to me, threatens a great deal of psychological theory. There's a lot of theorizing in psychology about the tremendous importance of the within-family situation, the peculiar things that happen when you're growing up. And we turn around and we look at these twins that are reared in entirely different families, and they're just as similar as twins reared in the same family. I've looked at the data, I'm collecting the data, and I'm still absolutely astounded. I still haven't settled down and absorbed this kind of a finding yet. How long is it going to take me?
I couldn't tell you, but so far I think you've done extremely well, and I'm very much impressed by the investigations you're doing here. Of course, you have the advantage that now you have very competent co-workers, and you have a lot of possibilities for doing almost everything, and that may refine the findings. The findings.
We do have, you had, there's one feature of your study that made it such a fine study, and that is you had an almost exhaustive population. You searched records, and you probably turned up almost every set of twins reared apart in Denmark. So you didn't have a bias in the twins who came to your study.
No.
We're plagued with the problem of recruiting in a wide variety of different ways.
Yes.
And I think people, as you pointed out to me, people will probably say, oh, you have these striking findings because only similar twins come to you. Would you comment on that?
Yes. I think Shields in London with his series had the same problem because they were, the start there was a BBC program where they wanted to they asked monozygotic twins to come forward, and of course that's theoretically an objection, because many people will say that they're similar, they're strikingly similar, and that's the reason why they come to you, and they find it interesting, fascinating that they are so similar. Well, I don't think that's a serious problem, because not with regard to the differences, because the differences are still the most important things to find out, and also you'll find results, or you will notice things that cannot be directly influenced by this consciousness about being monozygotic twins. Of course, you could consider the possibility, and I know you're doing that, of investigating dizygotic twins, which
we're hoping there'll be a partial control on that kind of a selective bias.
That certainly will. Another thing, of course, would be to compare it with non-twins in some way, a material. You may need control material of some kind to counteract,
well, we've been thinking of creating control groups selected from our own sample. We would, for example, match individuals of the same age, of the same sex, and perhaps of the same social class within our sample, and see how similar they are, and contrast that with our twins. And of course, we're studying spouses whenever possible, and so they have about the same age and the same social background. So we have a large population of individuals that we can select from. But there are some inherent limitations. It's certainly not a perfect experiment, as no experiment is. We haven't found any classically mentally ill twins, but we found a lot of sort of modest psychiatric symptoms in many of our twins. What were your findings with respect to that?
It was about the same. Several cases you found at least neurotic symptoms and clear-cut neurosis, and character or personality disorders. And perhaps that should be stressed, that the picture there was generally one of striking similarity, which of course is not that surprising to me, but maybe other people would find that very surprising.
Well, I think there's been a general belief that perhaps the more serious psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and the depressions might have a strong genetic base, but I think most people have felt that the neuroses, for example, are predominantly environmental, within family kind of a
that's been
thing.
The general attitude.
But our data would, as it stands now, clearly contradicts that. Your findings were the same.
About the same, yes, and the Shields data were also in that direction. So that's one important thing. If I should try to say very briefly, and I think you'll agree with that, if we put it in this way, in which respects were the twins strikingly similar, obviously similar, and where did they differ strikingly? I could summarize my findings very briefly. I would like to have your comment on that.
Go ahead, you summarize and I'll comment.
First of all, they looked alike.
Oh boy,
That
no
sounds
question.
trivial, but actually, your physical appearance and your hair color and your eye color,
yeah.
your face,
The way you smile, yeah.
the way you walk, the way you talk, the voice, all these mannerisms, they were strikingly alike. And if, for instance, I talked to the twins on the phone, I could take them easily. If I saw them from behind, again confusing.
I think I mentioned to you that we had the case with Jim Springer and Jim Lewis. They had our first set of twins. They came here, and we videotaped them. And because they were in our first twins, we hadn't really completed the assessment that we would like to have had. So we brought them back 6 months later. And I recall playing a videotape. They asked to put the tape on, and I put the videotape on, and I said, I don't know which twin is on this tape. And the voice came on, and Jim Lewis said, oh, that's me. And the picture came on, and it was his brother. So as a demonstration of similarity in voice, that was perfect.
Yes, but generally, if you have that in a family, many psychologists will say, well, that's easy to explain because they are identifying with each other, or
modeling.
They are imitating, or consciously or unconsciously. And you can see that in families, a boy developing in the same way as his father did, and so on. But these studies, yours and mine, and the Newman studies and Shield studies, demonstrate clearly that such hypotheses are not at all necessary, because you see the same with persons who have never met, don't know about each other, don't know about the family. So to begin with, that's very important, this behavior, and that's part of your personality. That's part of the impression the environment will have of you. So it will influence the environment to some degree. And if you go deeper into it, and as you're doing, investigating the brain activity,
brain waves, oh yes.
Yes, the
EEGs.
and the ECG,
Yeah.
and many other things, you'll find that they are as similar as the same investigation done twice on the same person. And then, of course, at a certain point, you'll find differences. The differences will begin to appear. But then, as you stated, what is the difference? Is it a difference if you have an IQ difference, say 5 points? Is that a difference?
Well, it's still within the standard error of measurement of the instrument.
Right, yes, so it's not a difference.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So
We have many cases where, for all practical purposes, there really is no difference.
No difference.
Yeah. In fact, we do have 2 sets of twins that are within a point, I believe, right now.
Yes.
Remarkably similar. Yeah.
So perhaps what is needed are environments that differ more than environments do in general. I think Sir Francis Bacon, who was the first one to...
Oh, you mean Galton?
Oh, sorry, Galton.
Yeah.
Not Bacon, no,
Bacon,
Galton. Sir Francis Galton. He said something that... he said something like, nature prevails enormously over nurture within the same rank, provided that you're studying twins within the same rank of society.
Yeah, yeah.
So what he meant was actually that if you have differences that are unusual from one home to another, there may be the possibility that such factors will create a difference.
Yeah.
But within what is ubiquitare, what's that, everywhere in the society?
Yeah, things that are equally distributed
Yes,
across the
yes.
society, yeah.
There may not be...
Yeah, one of the consequences that I point out to my classes, and that don't seem to sort of get into the public consciousness, is that as we create more and more egalitarian and equal societies with equal opportunity, the differences between individuals become more and more genetically based.
Mhm.
And the differences don't go away. The overall range may be reduced somewhat, but the differences don't go away, and they become more and more genetic, which is a sort of a paradoxical
Yes.
finding. If you're an environmentalist, if you believe that there are genetic differences, it's a natural consequence.
You asked me how I came into this, and it costed me 10 years of my life. Time.
Well,
And how did you?
I came into it. I came into the study of twins reared apart, not by accident, not entirely by accident. Approximately 3 to 4 years ago, I had been reading some twin literature, and I had gone back and re-reviewed the Newman, Freeman, and Holzinger book, and I just thought that was such a beautiful experimental design. I love simple designs that are cutting and definitive.
Yes.
And that design, the twin design with twins reared apart, struck me that way. And I talked to my colleague, Alka Tellegen, about the possibility of doing a twins reared apart study. And we chatted about it over coffee and over lunch a few times. And we simply could not solve the problem of how to find such twins. I had never seen a newspaper story about them or anything. And we thought, well, could you take out a big ad in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times? And we looked into the cost of that, and it was just enormous. And so we put the idea aside. And about a year or so later, a newspaper story appeared in the local newspaper of a set of twins, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer. And I heard about it from one of my graduate students in a seminar that evening, and I said, please get that into my mailbox tomorrow. Yes. When I got in early the next day, somebody had already put it in my mailbox. See, I had talked about twins and twin studies,
Yes.
although I'd never conducted one. And there it was, and all these striking similarities were noted in the story. Well, I had worked on a university committee allocating research funds for many, many years, and I knew the committee was set up to support research that needed immediate funding. I got on the phone, I called the dean, and I asked him for money immediately, and he gave it to me. And I got on the phone, and I called the newspaper reporter who wrote the story, and within 2 days I had Springer and Lewis on the phone and persuaded to fly to Minneapolis. And that's how I got into it. They volunteered. They were delighted to come. In fact, they were a lot of fun to work with. They really were helpful. But in the process of searching for them, I talked to a woman who was a reporter for the Associated Press. And she was the one who had written the story about them. And she said, I'll tell you who wrote the story. Why don't you tell me why you're interested? And I had that all worked out because that's what I was going to tell Springer and Lewis. And so I told her the story of why identical twins reared apart are valuable. And it wasn't until later that I realized she was typing this down on a typewriter. And she said to me, well, how are you going to be able to afford to do this? And I said something along the lines, I'm going to beg, borrow, or steal in order to do this.
Yes.
Well, I had given her a very good line, and the article she wrote appeared in the New York Times the following Sunday, even before I had contacted and got Springer and Lewis to agree to come. And that story elicited more twins, and our study started to move from that point.
So now you collected 21?
We've collected 21 sets of identical twins reared apart, and we have quite a few more contacts. If we can raise the funds, there's no question we'll be able to study over 50.
You think 50? That will be the largest material in the world?
It'll be the largest single collection in the world, and I no longer believe that that's the limit. We have leads on a very large number 100 is not impossible if we could get the funding.
I must say that I'm very impressed by this, because I visited Shields in the beginning of the 60s, and we discussed the possibility of doing such a study, and we came to the conclusion that it was not likely that such a study could be done anymore, because in most countries people tend to think that twins should not be separated, they should be brought up together. So we felt that it was about the end of that phenomenon. But I'm very surprised that you have been able to find within such a short time 20 cases, so your prediction may be true that you could find 50 cases.
Well, we have some definite advantages. I think there's much more worldwide communication. There's television now.
Yes,
television was not nearly as popular in those days, although Shields did use television.
Oh yes, he did. I think it was the
Bronowski program.
Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting, I've gone back and read parts of Newman, Freeman, and Holzinger, and of course they recruited by radio. Radio and newspaper.
That was the Chicago Festival of some kind.
Oh, there was a World's Fair in Chicago at the time also. Yeah, of course that was an inducement for twins to come to Chicago.
Yes.
Of course, one advantage your study had, and our study has over Newman, Freeman, and Holzinger, is they were very careful in their recruitment. They didn't bring anyone to Chicago unless they were convinced that they were identical twins, whereas we're recruiting both identical and fraternal twins, and so we're not excluding those identical twins who might be different.
No, that's very important that you stress that, because that is another objection, of course.
I never had the opportunity to meet Jim Shields. He died a few years ago, but he was, of course, a close friend and colleague of Professor Gottesman, who basically seduced me into the twin business by constantly giving me papers to read about twins. I must say, it's his fault that I'm doing this, but I'd appreciate it if you'd say a few things about Shields and the discussions you had with him.
I would be glad to do so, because he was a remarkable man. He was originally trained as a social worker, I think, when quite young, and in 1940 he went to France, and he was captured and was in a German camp during the whole of the war. Then he came back and continued his training in social science, and then he started to take an interest in general in genetic factors in mental disorders. But then he was hit by a very nasty polio, and he was paralyzed completely.
I understand that was just before the creation of the vaccine.
Yes. And he was in a wheelchair, and he did all that work, collecting the 40-some cases, and doing it without any assistance at all, hardly. He did the interviewing, he did the psychological testing. He was alone. He was in an office there could only be 2 chairs in his office, and there he sat quite alone and worked, and I remember visiting him, and he was, as Gottesman probably have told you, quite unusual man and gifted man. He was a very conscientious researcher. He was very careful man in all respects, and I came to London when I was doing my study, and his study was published in 62, I think, and mine in 65. So my book has been very much influenced by his publication, in the way that I felt that what I could do was to supplement his more extensive investigation with a deeper probing a more intensive study
of individual cases.
Yes, of the individual cases, and I was able to do follow-up studies, and that's very easy in Denmark to follow persons, and so in this way, his work was of the greatest importance for my work, and very sad message.
Professor Gottesman constantly urges me to go back and read what Shields said about this and what Shields said about that, because of the great care and thoroughness and thoughtfulness with which he addressed all of these questions. And I've always found it productive to do that. There's no question about it.
I had the opportunity to study one single case together with him. It's not included in my study, but in his. That was a widely separated pairs, monozygotic twins. One was brought up in Chile, and the other one was brought up in Denmark. But that twin, the last mentioned, moved to London, and I interviewed her there, and so we had this pair together, and that was quite interesting.
That was remarkable. Yeah. I've never had the opportunity to talk to anyone who knew either Newman, Freeman, or Holzer. I understand you've talked to Newman's son.
Yes, that's the same thing. I was visiting San Francisco, it must have been 10 years ago or something like that, and a young man came to the hospital where I was visiting, and he told me his name was Freeman, and he would like to talk to me. And we talked for about 30 minutes before I realized that he was the son of Freeman. And he could tell me quite a lot about Freeman, and he asked about he had read my book, and I haven't heard from him since then, but
my understanding is he is a social scientist of some sort.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
It's a bit surprising that this study done in the 30s, 70.
1937 it was published.
1937. Yeah. That in your country, well, I wouldn't say it has been ignored, but very few people have read the entire book, and I must compliment you for doing a new study in this country, because one has to wonder why.
I think there's a reason. I think American psychology has been overwhelmed by a naive behaviorism which really had no regard for genetic processes. I think that's been quite unfortunate. Of course, it's had its positive side as well, but I think it's been unfortunate overall for psychology, and I think there probably have been people interested but who could never pursue it. I might comment that reviewers of our proposals, a number of them, their major criticism and the grounds on which they said we shouldn't be funded was that we'll never find more than a few cases, and therefore we'll never be able to draw any conclusions, and therefore why spend the money? You have any comments on that point of view?
Oh yes, I think these cases are valuable because they're a challenge. You have to read these case histories in all details, and people should try to use their mini series about people have many theories,
and they're a good test of those theories.
Yes, they should try to test their theories and test their testing on these cases, and then they'll find out they get into difficulties
very quickly. As a matter of fact, I don't think I've had my mind changed about more issues in my entire life than after I confronted a few sets of monozygotic twins reared apart.
I absolutely think it's worthwhile, and I hope that you'll be able to proceed and that you'll get the funding for it, because I think it's your study is unique, and you have possibilities which neither Newman or Shields or I have had, and there may there may come forward some, well, not one general conclusion, because that's not possible, but several conclusions of importance, of clinical importance, because environment, we being a psychiatrist or psychologist or sociologist or anything, teacher, you have to assume that environment means something.
And makes a difference.
Yes, and then you should have a scientific basis for this assumption. I mean, it's futile to do a lot of treatment if treatment is, you have to concentrate your treatment there where it's likely to have an effect on an individual.
Yeah.
And I'm quite sure that you can outline that many people can be influenced by environmental factors such as psychotherapy or any, like they can be influenced by drug therapy or any physical
I think
thing.
the
But you have to have a realistic basis for your therapeutic attitude and your selection of cases for treatment.
I think the question is, what is the trait-relevant environment? What are the real environmental, instead of saying, well, the environment is the cause, what you have to find are the specific environmental features that make a difference.
Yes.
I think that's the real goal.
Well, it's you can say it in daily life. When I work with patients, I put on another cap and I assume that what I'm doing is good for the patient, and I'm moving around with environmental things, and I'm establishing a theory about the development of the psychiatric history and so, and I'm not interfered by any control of that. Anything can fit into my personal subjective experience of the patient, and I can go on from that. And if I'm lucky, my treatment is okay, but it's more luck than knowledge, really.
That's true.
And I may have the wrong theory about it, but I may be lucky in my treatment, or the other way about. But I think we talked about the concept of neurosis and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, that and I personally think that Freud realized that biological factors were really of importance for whether you become neurotic or not. Once
They
you
set the predisposition in a
well,
sense.
yes, once you became neurotic, of course, psychological laws of some kind were in operation, but he didn't deny the importance
Of biology.
No, he didn't.
Yeah.
His successors tend to ignore it or to pay lip service. Yes, of course, there's something like genetics, but who cares?
Bringing up Freud in this context raises an interesting question, and we haven't discussed it at all. One of the striking things that we've discovered in some of our twins is a common developmental history. We've had twins come down with headaches at about the same age. The disorder would manifest itself over a period of time, and then it would abate. We've had twins who've had learning difficulties at about the same age, had psychiatric treatment. It went away. We've had other twins who've shown hyperactivity at about the same period of time. It would go follow a particular course and disappear. And it clearly looks as though a genetic clock is sort of turned on, runs its course and goes off, and then maybe comes on again, or another clock goes on. When we first discovered this, I was absolutely amazed, because I'd been trained in the tradition of believing that traits that have high constancy are more likely to be genetic, but traits that fluctuate are not. And of course, Ronald Wilson's work with infant twins, these longitudinal studies, have
Mm-hmm.
been showing this synchronicity in development, and our data really links in very, very nicely with his
Yes.
work. I was wondering whether you made any observations along these lines.
Oh yes, I think I did, of course. How should I put it? I strongly agree with you that that's the. If we could pick up something like migraine, the headache, rather typical migraine, I have two cases, both concordant, and in one case, the twin was brought up with the mother who also had migraine, but then she was brought. The other twin was brought up in quite a different environment. But if you had that single case,
You'd say it was a learned
you could
psychosomatic kind of response.
Yes, you could explain that very easily, and but I think sometimes you'll see that if you do a longitudinal study, if you do a cross-sectional study, just one investigation.
What we're doing now, basically.
Yes, you might find some differences, but if you are doing a longitudinal, the next time they might again be discordant, but the opposite way around. You understand
That's right,
what I mean?
yes.
But
Irving has found this, Irv Gottesman has found this with schizophrenic twins. On
Yes.
occasion you'll find them discordant, but
Yes.
then one will remiss and the
Yes.
other one will manifest a
Yes.
disorder.
Yes.
And depending
So-
on where you slice it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But still, it's reasonable to say they are concordant.
Certainly, they're just slightly out of sync.
Yes.
And-
Well, the concept of concordance is a difficult one, really, because very often you hesitate to say that they are concordant, but as a Swedish colleague said to me once, they're not discordant.
Yes,
Because
concordant and not discordant
He
would be
waited
different.
10 years before he said, now they are concordant with regard to schizophrenia. Now I'm satisfied. They're concordant now. But 10 years earlier,
They were not.
They were not concordant, but they were not discordant either.
Yeah.
And I think that will very often be the result that you'll feel that one has a definite characteristic. The other one is a bit difficult to very many people will say, well, they're just discordant.
Yeah, we have a few cases where one twin will be divorced and the other is not divorced.
Yes.
So you have a dramatically different social environment at
Yes.
the moment.
Yes.
And the twins behave differently
Yes.
toward each other and toward others, in fact, during the course of an assessment. We've watched that. And I have the very strong feeling that if the married twin were to be divorced, he or she would have a very similar behavior pattern. You get the sense, but they're not. One is married and one is not. And so the controlling circumstances in the environment are clearly shaping differences.
Mhm.
There's no question. It's an important environmental fact. And you can see that when the environment changes, most likely they'll become quite similar. So it shows the importance of the environment, and it shows the importance of the genetic predispositions and
Yes.
the personality
Yes.
pattern. It's clear, as Professor Licken has pointed out, that as you work with these twins, you become more impressed with genetic effects, but you also become more impressed with environmental
Yes,
effects and
yes.
how they work.
And there's room enough for
There's room
both.
for both.
But the interaction is complicated but fascinating.
Oh, well, yeah, I think I pointed out a few minutes ago, one of the reasons I became very interested in doing this research was because of the real neatness, the logical neatness of the design.
Yes.
But when you end up working with these twins and you start studying their lives in great detail, you really see how complicated the situation is. The apparent simplicity of the design is just overwhelmed by the complexity of individual
Yes.
lives. There's no question.
Mm.
Yeah. as we've been touring the labs and you've been commenting on the tremendous facilities that we have,
Yes.
I tend to have this guilt feeling because we do have, I think, really excellent facilities for the work. And I think back of Len Heston doing his study of adopted children, single-handedly practically chasing around the country to find his cases.
Yes.
And Jim Shields working in his wheelchair, and you working literally alone gathering that data. It seems almost unfair. I've got all of these facilities, I've got excellent colleagues, but I think it shows that
well, I never regret, and you'll never regret, but what I would like to support there is that I think that research money are giving for many purposes where the series are much looser and the design is really just well, I think these kind of studies should be clearly supported, and especially because they're difficult to do and they take a lot of years, and I think it would be worthwhile to do many more of these nature-nurture studies.
I've slowly shifted from the point of view that we're going to answer in a clear-cut way certain kinds of questions, to a point of view that you've sort of constantly prodded me with in the last few days, that a good scientific study raises important questions as well, and our data is doing that. I think it's really raising questions.
And questions that may be answered by doing other kinds of studies, not twin studies, but it should be applied to other.
Yeah, I think complementary adoption studies would be very useful. Of course, we've tried to do this. We've borrowed a great deal of material from the Hawaii study and the people in Boulder who were doing an adoption study. Many of our psychological tests and questionnaires match those in their designs, so that at some point much of the data can go into a common model to estimate effects. So that our hope is that we have a piece of work that can intermesh with other people productively.
Yes, before we close, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me here. This has been a great experience.
Well,
I'm very impressed, and I wish you the very best.
Well, thank you very much.
For the
it's been
future.
a privilege to talk with you, and it's been very, very illuminating. And I don't think I could have thought of something that could have been more enjoyable for 2 days had I thought for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.